The room went completely still when my father walked through those doors. He wasn't supposed to be there. The Whitmore Medical Excellence Gala was my husband's event, his family's night, their crowd, their rules. I had spent 7 years learning exactly where I was and wasn't allowed to exist in that world. And yet, there was my father, 72 years old, in a navy suit I'd never seen before, walking straight toward the podium like he owned the floor. My mother-in-law's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. I stayed at table 9 in the back corner where my husband had placed me. Far enough from the stage that I wouldn't overshadow the evening he'd said that morning while straightening his tie. I hadn't argued. I never argued anymore. I'd learned that arguing cost more than it was worth. But I watched my father cross that room, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift in my chest. Let me go back to the beginning, because the ending won't make sense without it. I met my husband at 31. I was a registered nurse at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, working overnight shifts in the cardiac unit, living in a studio apartment in Leslieville that smelled like old radiator heat in winter. He was the kind of man who made everything feel like it was finally falling into place. Tall, confident, from a family that had been prominent in Ontario's private medical sector for 3 generations. He laughed at my jokes. He called me brilliant. On our 3rd date, he said he'd never met a woman who worked as hard as I did. I should have paid more attention to the fact that he said worked, like it was something slightly unusual, something worth remarking on. We married 18 months later. Small ceremony at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. My father toasted us and cried. My sister caught the bouquet. I remember thinking that morning, standing in front of the mirror in my dress, that my life was beginning. It was beginning. I just had no idea what kind of life it would be. The first thing that changed was small. He mentioned, gently, that it might look odd for a Whitmore wife to be working night shifts. His mother had never worked. His sister didn't work. There was a certain image, he explained, that the family maintained. He wasn't asking me to quit. He would never ask me to quit, but perhaps a more appropriate position? Something in administration, maybe. Something with regular hours in a more professional setting. I transferred to a clinic coordinator role. I told myself it was a compromise, not a concession. Then came the social calendar. The galas, the dinners, the charity committees where women with highlighted hair discussed fundraising targets over sparkling water. My husband coached me before every event. Not loudly. He was never loud about it. He'd straighten my necklace and say something like, "You have a tendency to talk over people when you get excited, sweetheart. Just be aware of that tonight." Or, "The Hendersons are old money. Don't bring up where you grew up." Where I grew up was Sudbury. My father had worked in the mines for 22 years, saved every dollar, eventually opened a small mining equipment supply company that took another decade to become profitable. We weren't poor, but we weren't the Whitmores. My mother-in-law made sure I never forgot that. She never said anything cruel directly. She was far too skilled for that. It was always a slight tilt of the head, a gentle smile, a comment delivered so softly it was almost possible to believe you'd misheard. "That's an interesting choice for a gala, dear," about my dress. "It must be so different for you, all of this," while gesturing vaguely at the room around us. We always hoped Marcus would find someone established. Marcus. My husband. He let her say these things. He looked at his phone when she said them, or he refreshed his drink, or he stepped away to greet someone across the room. In 7 years, I cannot recall him once saying, "That's enough, that's not fair, that's not true." What he did say, and often, was, "You're too sensitive. She means well. You have to understand how she was raised." I understood perfectly well how she was raised. What I didn't understand yet was how I had allowed myself to be unmade so quietly. The nursing license renewal form sat on my desk for 6 months before I let it expire. He hadn't told me not to renew it. He'd simply said over dinner one evening that it seemed unnecessary given that I wasn't practicing and that the continuing education requirements were quite demanding, and didn't I have enough on my plate with the committee work? I heard the question. I heard what was underneath it. I let the deadline pass. That was the moment, I think, looking back, that was when I stopped being a nurse and started being a Whitmore wife. I want to explain something because the most common question people ask when they hear stories like mine is, "Why did you stay?" And I understand why they ask. From the outside, it seems so simple. You leave, you go. How hard can it be? Here is what it actually feels like from the inside. It feels like being in a room where the walls have moved 1 inch every week for years. You never notice the walls moving. You only notice, one day, that the room is very small and that you have somehow forgotten there were ever windows. By year 4, my social circle consisted entirely of people who knew me as Marcus's wife. My friendships from before the marriage had faded. I'd been too busy, too unavailable, and if I was honest, too ashamed to admit to my old friends how much of myself I'd handed over. My family visited less because every visit became a source of tension. My father once made a comment at Sunday dinner about the mining company expanding into Manitoba, and my husband said, pleasantly, "That must be nice, doing something on that scale," and the word "that" carried everything in it, that modest, that regional, that not quite serious, and my father heard it and went quiet for the rest of the meal. After that, my father called less. I told myself he was busy. What I didn't know was that he was building something. In my 5th year of marriage, I started waking up at 4 in the morning, not from nightmares, just awake, heart thumping, lying in the dark next to a man I had started to feel was a stranger, thinking about the cardiac unit at St. Michael's at 3 a.m., the particular sound of monitors, the weight of a patient's hand when they were afraid, the feeling of knowing exactly what to do in a room where everything was going wrong. I had been good at that. I had been so good at that. I started reading. At first, just nursing journals online on my phone under the covers while Marcus slept. Then I started looking at postgraduate programs. There was a 2-year program at the University of Toronto, Master of Nursing with a specialization in cardiovascular care. Fully online, designed for working professionals. Applications opened in January. I applied in secret. I told no one. I was accepted in March. I paid the tuition from a personal account Marcus didn't know existed. I'd been quietly setting aside a small portion of the household budget for 3 years. Nothing dramatic, $200 here, $150 there, the kind of amount that doesn't show up clearly if you're not looking for it. I told myself I was saving for emergencies. I was right about that, it turned out. The next 2 years were the strangest of my life. I was 2 people. During the day, I attended charity lunches and organized committee meetings and smiled at women who called me Marcus's Claire. Called me by a name that wasn't really mine anymore. At night, I studied vascular anatomy and evidence-based care protocols and wrote papers on heart failure management in aging populations. My grades were high. My professors didn't know I was doing this from a home office, while my husband thought I was taking an online photography course. The photography course was also real. I took it first and showed Marcus the landscape prints I framed for the hallway, so he'd see me on the laptop at night and assumed it was that. I am not proud of the deception, but I am not ashamed of it either. I was doing what I needed to do to survive something I couldn't yet name. I finished the degree in June of last year. I didn't tell Marcus. I didn't tell his mother. I accepted my certification letter by email and sat in the kitchen for an hour alone with a cup of tea that went cold, feeling something I couldn't quite identify. It felt like finding the windows again. The call from my father came 2 weeks later. We hadn't spoken properly in almost a year. My fault as much as his. I pulled away, embarrassed, not wanting him to see how small my life had become. But he called on a Tuesday afternoon and said he wanted to see me, that there were things he needed to tell me, that he'd made some decisions about the company, and I needed to hear them from him directly. I drove up to Sudbury on a Thursday. I told Marcus I was visiting a university friend in Ottawa. My father looked older. He'd had a cardiac event the previous winter. I'd known about it but hadn't come home, and that shame sat in my throat the entire drive up Highway 400. He made tea and we sat at the kitchen table where I'd done homework as a teenager, and he told me about the company. He had grown it. Quietly, steadily, the way he did everything. The mining equipment supply business had expanded into northern Alberta and northwestern British Columbia. He'd taken on investors carefully. The revenue was now, he said, placing a folder on the table in front of me, $38 million annually. The company itself had been valued at $61 million in the most recent assessment. I stared at the folder. "I'm not telling you this to impress you," he said. "I'm telling you because I should have told you years ago and because I have a decision to make." He wanted to step back from active management. He was 72. His heart had reminded him last winter that he was not permanent. He had two options: bring in an outside CEO or offer the role to someone he trusted completely. He looked at me for a long time. "You have a master's degree in cardiovascular nursing," he said. "I know about the program. I've known for 18 months. Dr. Varma at U of T is an old friend of mine." I opened my mouth, closed it. "You are the smartest person in this family," he said. "You have always been the smartest person in this family, and you have spent 7 years letting someone convince you otherwise." He paused. "The CEO role isn't nursing, I know that. But you understand operations. You understand care under pressure. You understand what it means to keep people alive when things go wrong. That's what running a company is." I drove home in a kind of daze. That was 4 months before the gala. The Whitmore Medical Excellence Gala was held at the Fairmont Royal York in downtown Toronto. Black tie, 300 guests, a 10-course dinner, and a silent auction benefiting a hospital foundation that bore the Whitmore name. My husband had been on the organizing committee. His mother was presenting the keynote address. I had been assigned, as usual, to a table near the back, table 9, with a seating plan that placed me between a woman I barely knew from the charity committee and an empty chair. I wore a dress I had bought myself. Dark green, structured, nothing Marcus had approved. I hadn't asked him to approve it. That had been a recent change. In the months since my father's visit, I had been quietly, carefully, doing a number of things. I had reactivated my nursing license. I had begun consulting with my father's CFO about the transition. I had spoken with the family lawyer, alone, in an office in Yorkville, paying from the personal account. I had not yet told Marcus any of this. I knew that once I told Marcus, the room would change very fast. I needed the walls to hold a little longer. He had noticed something was different. He couldn't name it, but I could feel him recalibrating. He was slightly more attentive, slightly more watchful. One evening, he'd picked up my laptop while I was in the kitchen, and I'd heard him set it down quickly. I didn't ask what he'd been looking for. I already knew. The gala began at 7. By 8:30, I had smiled at more people than I could count, declined 3 glasses of wine, and exchanged pleasantries with my mother-in-law, who looked at my dress and said, "That color is bold for you, dear." "Thank you," I said pleasantly, and turned away before she could redirect the comment. At 8:52, my father walked through the doors. I saw him before Marcus did. My father, in his navy suit, with the particular walk of a man who has decided something and is no longer negotiating with himself about it. He had with him a woman I recognized as his executive assistant, Sandra, who was carrying a slim leather portfolio. I put down my water glass. The room didn't freeze immediately. People noticed him gradually. First the people nearest the entrance, then a ripple outward. My mother-in-law was at the podium midway through her keynote when she stopped mid-sentence. I watched her face do something complicated. My husband appeared at my shoulder. "What is he doing here?" he said. "Not a question." "I don't know," I said. Which was only partially true. My father did not go to the bar or find a seat or do any of the things guests do when they arrive late. He walked toward the stage. 2 members of event staff stepped forward and he said something to them quietly and showed them something on his phone, and they stepped back. Marcus moved to intercept him. I watched this from the table. My husband was 6'2", broad-shouldered, trained from childhood to command rooms. He crossed the floor quickly, placing himself between my father and the stage, and bent toward him and said something with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My father looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped around him and continued toward the stage. My mother-in-law had stopped speaking. The room was quiet except for the ambient sound of 300 people holding their breath. My father climbed the 3 steps to the stage, gently took the microphone from the stand, and turned to face the room. "Good evening," he said. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Robert Beaumont. Some of you may know my company, Beaumont Industrial Supply. We've been operating out of Northern Ontario for 30 years. A murmur. My mother-in-law had stepped back from the podium but had not left the stage. "I'm here tonight because my daughter is in this room," he said. "And because there are people in this room who have spent 7 years telling her that she is less than she is. And I have waited too long to say this publicly." He paused. Sandra opened the portfolio and handed him a single sheet of paper. In 3 weeks, my daughter will be announced as CEO of Beaumont Industrial. The company has been valued at $61 million in our most recent independent assessment. She holds a Master of Nursing from the University of Toronto. She's the most capable person I have ever had the privilege of knowing. He looked at me across the room. But before that announcement, he said, I want to read something. This is an email sent by Marcus Whitmore to his colleague Dr. Peterson on February 14th of this year. My daughter is unaware that I have this. Marcus said, stop, from the floor. His voice cracked slightly on the word. My father read the email. I will not reproduce it here. What I will say is that it contained, in my husband's own words, written to a colleague on Valentine's Day, a description of me as not Whitmore material, never was, more of a project than a partner, and a reference to the prenup doing its job when the time comes. The time comes. He had been planning it. He had been managing the timeline of our marriage the way you manage a position you're preparing to close. The room was entirely silent. I sat at table 9 and felt something that I can only describe as the opposite of shock. It was clarity. The sharp, cold clarity of a diagnosis you already knew was coming. My father folded the paper. That is all I came to say, he said. I apologize for disrupting your evening. He descended from the stage, handed the microphone back to a stunned event staff member, and walked toward my table. He sat down in the empty chair beside me, the one that had been vacant all evening, and put his hand over mine. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, I said, and I meant it. Marcus did not come back to table 9 that night. I saw him near the bar with his mother, who was speaking to him in a low, urgent voice. I saw people near them create the polite Canadian distance that signals social disaster. I finished my water. I said goodbye to Sandra. I hugged my father for a long time at the coat check. I should have come sooner, he said into my hair. I should have let you, I said. The next 4 months were not easy, and I want to be honest about that because the easy version of this story would skip them. Ending a 7-year marriage, even one that had hollowed you out, is not a clean thing. There are lawyers and paperwork and the particular grief of packing a life into boxes. Not grief for the marriage itself, exactly, but grief for the person you were when it started. The woman who had stood in front of a mirror in Niagara-on-the-Lake believing everything was beginning well. My lawyer was excellent. The prenup, which Marcus had presented as standard and I had signed at 22 months into a relationship when I still believed I was being loved honestly, had a clause he had not counted on. Evidence of bad faith conduct rendered certain provisions void. My father's legal team had been thorough. Marcus's project email was not the only documentation they had gathered. I will not describe the settlement in detail. I will say that I walked out of that process with my nursing license, my master's degree, and enough financial stability to begin the CEO transition without pressure. I started at Beaumont Industrial on a Monday in September. My office is in Sudbury, and I drive up Sunday nights and stay at my father's house in my old bedroom with the window that looks over the backyard, and on those drives I listen to whatever I want to and stop for coffee when I feel like it, and I do not think about whether any of it is appropriate. The transition has been harder than I expected and more satisfying than I imagined. Mining equipment supply is not cardiovascular nursing. But my father was right, the skills translate. You are keeping something alive, monitoring systems, responding to failure before it becomes catastrophic. I have made mistakes. I have also made decisions that my father's CFO later told me were unusually good for a first-time CEO. There is a woman at the company. Her name is June, and she has been my father's office manager for 19 years. She knows every supplier, every contract, every relationship in the business. When I arrived, she was polite but reserved, clearly waiting to see whether I was serious or decorative. In my 3rd week, I asked her to walk me through the Alberta contracts from the beginning, every detail, and we spent 4 hours at a boardroom table going through binders, and by the end of it, she brought me a coffee without being asked. She is the first person I call when I don't know something. I have told her she is irreplaceable. I mean it. My mother-in-law has not contacted me since the gala. Marcus sent one email in the week after asking if we could speak privately. I did not reply. My father is stepping back slowly, the way we agreed. He still comes into the office 2 days a week, and sometimes I find him sitting in the break room talking with the old staff, the ones who've been there since the Sudbury days. And he looks more relaxed than I have seen him in years. Last month, he came to watch me present the Alberta expansion plan to the board. He sat in the back row and he didn't say anything, but when the board approved the plan and the room started buzzing with conversation, I looked up and he was already looking at me, and the expression on his face is something I will keep for the rest of my life. There is a moment in nursing, I don't know if people outside of healthcare ever understand this, when a patient's numbers stabilize, when the monitor settles, when the intervention worked and the worst has passed and you can allow yourself, just briefly, to exhale. You don't celebrate, not yet. You just become very quiet and very present, and you stay with that person because they need you to stay. That is what that morning felt like. I drive a car I chose myself. I live in an apartment in Sudbury that is smaller than any room in the house I left, and I have a window in the kitchen that faces east and gets morning light on the table where I have my coffee. And on Sunday evenings, when I arrive from Toronto, I open the window and listen to the neighborhood, and I feel, each time, the precise sensation of a room expanding around me. Not everything is resolved. I am still learning who I am when no one is measuring me. Some mornings I catch myself editing a sentence before I speak, softening something that didn't need softening, making myself smaller out of habit. I am working on that, but the monitors are steady. And for the first time in a very long time, I am the one in the room who knows exactly what to do. I keep thinking about the walls moving, not the walls at the Fairmont that night when my father read that email into a silent room. The walls I described earlier, the ones that shift 1 inch a week until you don't remember where they used to be. I lived inside that shrinking for 7 years, and the strange thing is that I was never unaware it was happening. I just didn't believe for a long time that I had the right to stop it. That's the part no one talks about. It isn't stupidity that keeps a person in a situation like mine. It was something closer to a failure of self-respect. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind you can point to and fix over a weekend. The quiet kind. The kind that accumulates in small moments, a dress you don't buy, a sentence you soften before you speak it, a form you let expire on your desk because someone made you feel the effort wasn't worth it. I was an educated woman. I knew, clinically, what gaslighting looked like. I had sat with cardiac patients at 3 in the morning and helped them find steady ground in the worst moments of their lives. And still I handed myself over, piece by piece, to someone who saw me as a project with an exit strategy. What changed wasn't a single decision. It was the accumulation of small, honest ones, waking up at 4 in the morning and choosing to read instead of just lying there, opening an application form instead of closing the tab, opening a bank account, driving to Sudbury on a Thursday and letting my father show me what he'd been building while I'd been making myself smaller. My father is not a complicated man. He worked in the mines for 22 years because that was what was available, and then he built something because that was what he could do, and he did both of those things with a straightforwardness that I have spent most of my adult life trying to grow back into. What he modeled for me, without ever naming it, was that your integrity is the one thing you can't outsource. You can lose your job, your marriage, your sense of direction, but if you've been honest and you have kept working and you have treated people decently, you have something to stand on when everything else gives way. That's what I think about when I think about June, my father's office manager, who waited 3 weeks before she trusted me and then gave me everything she knew when she decided I was serious. Or Maria, the fictional version of her, the one in stories like mine that always gets mentioned in the comments. The person who stayed loyal not out of obligation but out of genuine values and got recognized for it. Real loyalty like that doesn't exist in a vacuum. It grows in workplaces where people are treated as human beings. I am trying to build that. I am making mistakes and learning from them, which is the only honest way to do it. The monitors are steady, not perfect, steady. And I have learned, finally, that steady is enough to keep going. If you are somewhere inside that shrinking room right now, I want you to know that the walls can move back, not all at once. 1 inch at a time, the same way they closed. You pick up the form, you open the account. You drive to Sudbury on a Thursday. You let someone who loves you sit in the empty chair. That is how it begins again.